Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you and good morning. My name is Brad Williams. I am the Vice President of Government Relations here at the Chamber, and appreciate your time for being here. Appreciate you coming downtown today for our state budget briefing. I want to make sure everyone here knows that we are also live streaming this event this morning, and so if your question is especially embarrassing, it will be recorded and kept for all posterity. So make sure you're writing your question down. I also, before we get started, want to make note. You have at your place this little card here regarding an initiative that the Chamber is undertaking alongside the Secretary of State's office called Michigan Businesses United for Elections. Includes 3 easy steps that you can take as an employer to make sure that your employees are well informed as to what their rights and frankly their responsibilities as citizens are this year for the election. I think it's relatively straightforward, exceptionally non-controversial, but I would encourage you as employers to take a look at this and see how you can help your employees this year, this important election year. But we're here today because we have the good fortune of having 2 incredibly impactful public servants who are going to share some time with us today. Rachael Eubanks, the 47th State Treasurer of the state of Michigan, and Jen Flood. I don't know, Jen, do you know how many state budget directors there have been? Because it doesn't list it in your official biography. Okay. So Jen is, let's say, the 48th State Budget Officer of the state of Michigan. But what's important to know about both of them is that they've been with Governor Whitmer since day one and really have the ear of Governor Whitmer, not only when it comes to financial and fiscal matters, but all matters. They are the straw that stirs the drink in Lansing. Everyone, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. Everyone in Lansing plans their years around the work that these 2 do. It starts with Rachael and her colleagues at the House and Senate Fiscal Agency deciding at the beginning of the year how much money we have to spend. And then Jen and her team works with the governor's office to put out the executive budget sometime early in February, and we all race to see how we're going to distribute those resources until May, June, July. And then finally we can take a breath in June. Jen was just saying she spent her whole June in a conference room negotiating a budget. And now we're ramping up for September and October so we can spend some of the remaining money in a supplemental budget and close out the fiscal year. And all the while, Rachael and her colleagues are taking a look at the tax revenues to make sure we're not blowing the books. So they really are. They are the ones who kind of keep us all on schedule and make sure that we are distributing our resources responsibly. And as we know, our budget is a statement of values, not just for state government, but for who we are as a people. And I think we're going to hear a lot about what those values reflect this year. A few things that the Chamber was especially proud of. One is what we call the K-12 plus 2 ethos around education, that cost shouldn't be a barrier to getting 2+ years or 2 additional years of education beyond high school. We're very excited to see that go through, as well as 6th straight year of a balanced budget. So we're going to start with the 47th State Treasurer of the state of Michigan, Rachael Eubanks, and then Jen Flood is going to have some presentation, and then I am going to lead some questioning, but of course you are going to have plenty of time to ask questions too. In fact, that's the most important part of this. So get your questions ready, and we look forward to hearing them. So thank you for being here again, and Treasurer Eubanks, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Brad. And I was going to actually start off with how we go about coming up with the revenues and state budget, and Brad led into that for us. So he's somebody that understands this process obviously very, very well. Director Flood and I are often come to these presentations as a package deal. We're 2 sides of the same state fiscal coin. So I handle all things, revenue and she handles all things expenditures. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first, predicting revenues, you start with what's happening in the economy. That is the #1 predictor of how our revenues are going to perform as a state. And then we translate that through these processes that Brad touched on, the consensus revenue estimating conferences that we have in Michigan twice a year. And then we translate that, the economic component of which we all agree on, into state revenues, which we agree along with the legislature. So quickly, I just wanted to give a quick rundown of the Michigan Treasury and what it is and what we do. We're actually one of the largest and most diverse in terms of financial functions, treasuries in the country. And that allows us to consolidate most of the state's financial functions under one roof, which allows us to be extremely efficient. But of course, we do taxes, but we're not just taxes. I like to say that maybe that should be our motto. But it is a lot of taxes, okay? So we have about $30 billion taxes and fees, which translates into about 9.7 million tax returns every year. We also have jurisdiction over economic and revenue forecasting, which is going to be the bulk of my presentation. I'm also going to touch on some local government financial health issues. I know this has been a big issue here in Detroit, across the state, and touch on to say, okay, where do our local governments stand? That's a critically important part to our state's financial health. But if nothing else, when you leave today, we are the state's lost and found box, which means we manage unclaimed property. So if you have not yet, go to our unclaimed property website, put in your name, your business's name, your organization's name, see if there's any unclaimed property that you are owed back. You can submit a claim form right there, and you can get in touch with your unclaimed property. I'd love to hear if somebody finds something by the end of this presentation. That would be great. So starting, of course, we are in a small economy within the larger U.S. economy. I'm going to go through these early slides somewhat quickly, but just reflecting, we did go through a recession in the pandemic. It was very short, sharp, but short, certainly in comparison to the Great Recession, of which I think we all have trauma and scars related to, but it was a much faster process to get through that. The U.S. economy has now far surpassed its economic production than pre-pandemic levels. Consumer Price Index, so this is a measure of inflation, of course. The Fed has made it clear that inflation remains enemy #1 that they're looking to address, and they're adjusting monetary policy until inflation gets to be about the 2% range. So how close are we to getting to that 2% range? The blue line here is the full basket of goods that consumers purchase. The purple line is the core, which strips out very volatile commodities such as food and energy from that index. Both of those have remained stubbornly high. Of course, the overall basket hit 40-year highs in 2022, as we saw the price of goods and everything that we're looking to purchase run up. But even still, it's still remaining above that 2% level. The Fed is, despite what's happening in the economy, has kept rates high, saying that they're looking at this, and that sets the stage for a lot of the other production, which we'll talk about. I did want to pull apart inflation into various pieces because inflation is not impacting every sector of the economy equally. If I'd come and talk to you all 2 years ago, I would be talking about how on earth are you going to get a used car? It is so expensive. I mean, at one point, the prices of used cars are up to 20 or 40%. And they have been actually one of the areas that have seen the biggest amount of price decrease over the last calendar year, so from June 23 to June 24. But the other areas we're still seeing some high levels. In particular, I'll point out shelter. So this is the cost of housing that has remained very, very expensive. A lot of that has to do with just the red hot real estate market that hasn't really cooled down in terms of pricing, as well as interest rates on mortgages. I would point out food at home. So this is grocery store food. Has very low levels of inflation at 1%. So that's really good news. We want to make sure when people go to the grocery store, they can afford what's on the shelves. On the right-hand side, we've separated inflation into goods and services. The purple line is goods. The teal line here is services. Goods, we are in deflationary territory, which in some respects is not entirely surprising. During the pandemic, when we had that run up in demand for goods, people were buying a lot of things, supply chains were tighter, and that caused a lot of goods to run up. But as we kind of reset to the new normal, there's been some adjustment and restructuring in those prices, which we're seeing here in the goods reduction. Services, though, still a very high level of inflation. The majority of costs in the services sector, as I think everyone in this room knows, probably provides many services in this room, are salaries. So as there's still pressure, a very tight labor market, low levels of unemployment, a workforce participation rate, which is below U.S. averages still, although we've seen some improvement, services are still at that 5% inflation rate. So another area to watch very closely. Now, consumer sentiment is an interesting index of which kind of gauges how consumers are feeling about the economy. which historically translated into what they do. So if consumers are feeling great about the economy, they're likely to spend, contribute to our expansion, and when they're feeling negative about the economy, it tends to be they're pulling back on expenditures. But in this case, we've seen sort of a disconnect between what consumers are feeling about the economy and what they're actually doing. So we have seen a sentiment at record lows for a long time, whether that was related to the pandemic, whether that was inflation. Actually, inflation had a surprisingly high impact on how consumers felt about the economy, but it didn't stop what they were doing. They kept on spending. So it's been a little bit of, in the last couple of years, trying to figure out when forecasting state revenues, what are those metrics that we can look at from an economic perspective that will translate into what the future of our revenues will look like. Moving ahead to mortgage rates, I touched a little bit on the Fed, and the Fed watching very closely into inflation. And of course, mortgage rates track what the Feds do very, very closely. So you'll see here back in 2021, we saw an all-time record low in mortgage rates. I know here in Detroit, we have a large mortgage finance industry that was extremely busy during that period of time. But then we saw rates start to increase on mortgages very quickly, and that translates to increased costs for homes. So if you take into account a $250,000 house between 2021 and 2024, buying that same house, of course now it wouldn't be the same house, right? It would be one of lesser quality, but we can see it's about $431 a month more that people are paying just because mortgage rates are higher if they're buying a new house. And that of course means you've got less discretionary income to spend on other things, which can impact other consumption patterns. So watching the Fed means also watching what's happening in the mortgage and housing market very closely. It wouldn't be a Michigan conversation around the economy without talking about what's happening in the auto sector. Really interesting trends have continued in the auto sector. The top T line here is the total amount of light vehicle sales that we've seen across the U.S. And the light green line here is light trucks. The light blue line is cars. So light trucks are anything, think about SUVs, crossover vehicles, pretty much anything that's not a pickup truck or that type of truck. And what you've seen here is, one, even before the pandemic, we saw a big change in production between those two categories of vehicles. But of course, it's accelerated in the middle of pandemic because the automakers responded to supply chain challenges, such as microchips and other pieces of vehicles, by shifting those two materials, those limited scarce materials that they had, to the light truck vehicle segment, which is a higher margin, higher profitability product for them. And so because of that, even though they're selling less units than they did pre-pandemic, they're actually more profitable than they have been previously. So I think we've got less of a pressure to keep that unit sales high at that kind of 15 million units. Like for a long time, us economists would say, okay, 15 million units is about where the automakers are profitable, but now it's at a much lower level because we've seen a lot more profitability in that sector. I thought, and just touching on what does the auto sector mean for us in Michigan, it is a very important sector from an economic perspective. It's obviously critical to our perception of ourselves, part of our auto identity that we have in Michigan. But that is a sector that we've seen some contraction unemployment going back, the last 3 or 4 decades. So we've compared our 5 largest employment sectors here over the last 4 decades, starting in 1990 with the light blue line. You can see the top line manufacturing, primarily Michigan, this is auto vehicle manufacturing, about 21%, so more than 1 in 5 jobs came from that sector. If you fast forward, obviously, to the depths of the recession in 2010, contracted quite a bit. Now we're sort of hovering around that 13.8% level of our workforce. That's about the same as what we have in government, and it's even less than we have in education and health services or professional and business services, and certainly less than our number 1 industry now, which is trade, transportation, utilities. So think of this as like retail, warehousing, et cetera, a much smaller segment. So it's still very important to us as a state. It's just not as large of a sector proportionally as it used to be, which is also good news for us because as we think forward in predicting revenues, any manufacturing sector tends to be a lot more subject to the ups and downs of recessions. So having a little bit more diversified economy means we can be more resilient in the face of any future downturn that we could see. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I think, from both sides and for us what that means, but certainly having a diversified economy is a good thing. So how does that all translate into state revenue? So here on the left side, we've got the fiscal year 2024. So that's the fiscal year that we're currently in, ending September 30th, compared to the fiscal year 25, where Director Flood just recently wrapped up work on that year's budget. So we've broken these bars down into each of the revenue conferences that we had, starting in January 23, going through our most recent one in 24. And you'll see we had this, large 32.9 billion number, and then it sort of backed down in May 23 to $31.1 billion here for the general fund, school aid fund combined balances. Now, I'm sure you're thinking like, Eubanks, what the heck? You just got through telling me how great the economy is doing. What is the deal with this blue bar? Why are we seeing revenues come down a little bit? Well, of course, we did see some targeted tax changes, which contributed to that, but this dip is not due to economic factors, but due to what has been done from a tax policy perspective. But before I come back to what those changes were, I would just zoom in a little bit on our top 2 taxes in Michigan. This makes up about 2/3 of our tax base. The purple bars here are our actual performance. The teal bars are related to what we actually forecast in the revenue conferences that we do. And you'll see we had these huge increases in sales tax in fiscal years 21 and fiscal years 22 compared to the previous periods. And that's not just people buying more things, but people changed what they spent their money on. So in the pandemic, you're not doing as many services-based things. You're shifting towards buying bikes for the kids, a new RV, fixing up your house, the 2x4s that you get to Home Depot. Because we're mostly a goods-based services tax state, we saw that reflected in those sales tax numbers. But as we kind of look forward and think about what is that new normal, we basically forecasted a flat sales tax horizon going forward, recognizing uncertainty in consumer behavior, as well as what's going to happen on the price front. We saw earlier that there was some deflation on the goods side of consumer consumption patterns. So a very kind of flat base provides, I think, a nice stable base for revenues to be forecasted. On the right side, we look about individual income tax. So this is mostly reflected in withholdings that employers collect on behalf of their employees. And that's been kind of increasing at a steady pace. And we're forecasting that that will continue to increase throughout the forecast horizon, which ends in 2026. So here's these targeted tax changes I talked about, which were enacted in January of 2023. And first of all, we did have a remainder from the 2015 transportation package that required that if revenues surpassed the rate of inflation plus a multiplier, that it required a reduction in the income tax rate. So that did occur from 4.25% to 4.05%, and that was split across the 2023 year. The way that our fiscal years don't quite align with the calendar is why it spreads out over the 2 fiscal years, and that was reflected about $650 million. There was the $600 million that went towards those earmarks for the SOAR fund, which I'm sure Director Flood will talk about, as well as some housing and placemaking projects. So that reduced revenues another $600 million, and that is scheduled to sunset here in 2026. The earned income tax credit, or the working families tax credit, that was a big change for working families from 6 to 30%. We not only made that change for the current year and going forward, we also looked at retroactive for the 2022 tax year. The Department of Treasury sent out about 640,000 EITC supplemental checks for that 2022 tax year to families across Michigan, which went out in February and March of this year. The retirement tax, that was repealed and phased in over time through 2026, and we had some other changes here. So depending on the year, about $1.5 billion that reduced revenues, again, not from economic production, but from these targeted sustainable tax relief that was enacted back in January 23. But even with that, so the green bars here are the general fund component, because those tax changes impacted the general fund, not the school aid fund. You can see, so the hatch marks are where those targeted tax relief was implemented. So you can kind of see what revenues would have been otherwise. But still, even with those changes, revenues remain above pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so that allows a nice foundation base for new programs to come online on an ongoing sustainable fashion. Just quickly, I thought I would touch on, in my couple minutes left here, on investments in local governments, which have set them up for success at the state level in ensuring some financial stability. I think this governor and Director Flood's great work has restored revenue sharing for local units of government, which again to them is usually a critical, perhaps primary even source of revenues in many communities, to previous peak levels, which we're seeing around the turn of the millennium there. So big increase going forward. Having more money helps local governments to be able to keep their budgets on stable footing. From a school district perspective, there's a couple things going on here. One has been an increase in the per pupil funding allowance, but secondly, there's been greater partnership with the state through a package of early warning legislation that allows us, the Department of Treasury, to take a look at financial trends over several years and identify trouble signs on the horizon. So if you're to look at what a financial crisis for a school district would have looked like and you ran back the clock, typically a few years in advance we start seeing some signs that are concerning, such as reduction in pupil counts, reduction in fund balances. So as we look at those, we've seen great improvement since we started monitoring this about 10 years ago. Increasing fund balances, which means they can absorb more if they do receive some sort of shock to their operations, such as reduced pupil counts, and also less that are operating in a deficit position. So they're on great condition to be able to weather whatever comes next, even after the federal funding has been spent all the way through. I touched just a minute ago on the per pupil funding allowance. Has that set a nice foundation for them? Here's a history going back to see we're at this record amount for fiscal year 25 or upcoming year. That's a little bit of a translation here, as the fiscal year 25 budget did not include a traditional per pupil funding balance, but the state stepped in to pay some of their retirement expenses on behalf of those districts. But if you translate it to per pupil, that's what it would look like. So record high levels of funding for school districts. And then again, going back to the local government side, we're seeing those deficits reduce as well. So as they're getting additional revenue, we're seeing more of them in that position where they've got some fund balance, they're ready to weather what comes at them. A big piece from the 2023 budget was the state contributed about a $750 million program to bring all local units of government whose pension funding or OPEB funding, their legacy costs, were below a 60% funding level up to that 60% of funding. So about 123 communities received in some cases, considerable amount of funding to get them all up to that level. That means that those communities are spending less on their unfunded portion of their liabilities. They can invest it more in current programs today. And across the board, you see this nice increase in that funding ratio, up to about $9.42 billion, of which they are funded. So, and more great news for local governments. So Brad did such a great job of setting us up for this process. And my handoff to Director Flood. So we start in January with the consensus revenue estimating process. That is a twice-a-year process where I get together with the House and Senate fiscal agencies, and Director Flood joins us. We agree on these economic factors we talked about. We also agree on what the revenue forecast would look like, and then that is set. So then the question becomes is how does that pie get divided through the process? So that is where I will hand it off to Director Flood. There we go.
Thank you. I'm just going to sit here. Good morning. Yes. So excited to be here with all of you today, and want to thank Sandy and Brad and the whole Detroit Regional Chamber team for hosting us. We're really excited for this conversation and appreciate the work of so many folks in the room to help with both the development of the budget and in our final negotiations. As Brad mentioned, we just wrapped up the fiscal year 25 budget, and I might need to update your chart a little bit because we've started on fiscal year 26 going back a couple weeks. So lots of good work underway, but we're here to talk about fiscal year 25, which kicks off on October 1st. I've got some of our top priorities from the budget this year that we'll talk a little bit more about: helping kids learn, how can we lower costs for families, grow our economy, build more housing, reduce crime, improve infrastructure, expand access to healthcare, and maintain our record of fiscal responsibility. Balancing the budget. So when we talk about the budget, the fiscal year 25 budget was $82.5 billion, which sounds big, and it is. But a lot of the work that we do is focused on the general fund. So if you take out federal funding, restricted funds, what we're talking about is about $15 billion. About half of that goes to Health and Human Services, another 20% to Public Safety. Higher education is a big slice, and school aid is $19 billion. I wanted to talk brag a little bit about our partnership between Treasury, the Budget Office, and under the Governor's leadership of fiscal responsibility. So by the end of this budget year, the state will have paid down $21 billion of debt since the governor took office. This year we paid off early a MIPSR's OPEB liability, which freed up almost $700 million that's going directly into the classrooms, and our state's credit rating has been improved as well. Our budget stabilization fund, the rainy day fund we call it, is at a record all-time high. After a $50 million deposit this fall, will be at nearly $2.2 billion. One of the things I'm most proud of in this budget is what we call the Michigan Guarantee, and this actually came out of the Growing Michigan Together Council, which the governor kicked off a little over a year ago. We were lucky to have Sandy serve on that. That really was a collaboration between public sector, private sector, nonprofit, and other thought leaders on how do we grow our state's economy and grow our population. And this pre-K through 14 guarantee was one of the recommendations that came out of it, and we were able to get it done in this budget. So every family has a guarantee of high quality, tuition-free education from pre-K all the way through an associate's degree, as well as up to $27,000 towards a bachelor's degree. So in the budget this year, we're expanding free pre-K for 4-year-olds in Michigan. This is going to be a major team effort, both to get information out that that's available and to fill slots and recruit new teachers. So we're going to make huge strides towards it in the next fiscal year. That saves families $10,000. And as a mother of a toddler and an infant with a double daycare payment, I'm very excited about this one. More money into K-12. I mentioned earlier that we, in partnership with Treasury, paid down a liability for teacher health care benefits and retirement. That freed up $670 million into the school aid fund. This year we invested that by doing $600 million to districts through a reimbursement for their MIPSR's payments. It works out to be about $400 per pupil, and it's the equivalent of a 4.2% foundation allowance increase. This builds on the 5% increase that we did last year and the 5% the year before that, so it's another record education budget going right into the classrooms. We're investing $133 million in student mental health and safety initiatives, and also continue to invest in literacy. This year, we're expanding the Achievement Scholarship so that every high school graduate can earn an associate's degree or skills certificate from a community college tuition-free. This saves up to $4,800 a year. We made another deposit into the Michigan Achievement Scholarship Fund to make sure that this continues long into the future. And as I mentioned, this scholarship can save up to $27,500 towards a 4-year degree. And I wanted to shout out the Detroit Regional Chamber and a lot of partners in this room who've been working on the Detroit Promise for a long time, so the state's catching up to all of you here, but this is exciting to me in that, especially for first-generation college students, if you think about the lifelong trajectory that those kids face and the generational benefits, access to higher-paying jobs, and what it's going to do for individuals, for families, and for Michigan's economy as we skill up. Universities and community colleges saw a 2.5% increase in this year's budget. We're also continuing to invest in talent and work towards the governor's goal of 60% of Michiganders with a certificate or degree by 2030. So we've got about $55 million ongoing for the Going Pro program, $52 million ongoing for Reconnect, which is our program that allows Michigan residents to earn a degree or certificate tuition-free. We kicked this off under Republican legislature in a bipartisan effort and have continued to build on and expand that. And then we have some new efforts to grow talent and our population in MEDC and LEO. In the economic development space, this continues to be a priority. Another recommendation of the Growing Michigan Together Council was to create an evergreen fund. We were able to get that done in this year's budget. So it'll be a public-private fund that supports high-growth, high-wage, scalable startups and entrepreneurship. We have the Contracting Revolving Loan Fund, which helps small and disadvantaged businesses access state contracts. New Community and Worker Economic Transition Office. We think of two of our biggest sectors, automotive and energy. We're at a pivotal moment where we're making some big transitions. So this new office, we will be standing up to help workers and employers navigate some of those changes. And then Pure Michigan Marketing, this one everyone knows and loves. We've got $14 million one time and $1 million ongoing. Improving infrastructure. We won't do a presentation without talking about fixing the damn roads. And so we've got the final tranche of bonding for Rebuilding Michigan kicking off this year. The budget includes a total of $4.2 billion for road and bridge construction projects, including $1.7 billion in additional federal resources because of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's a couple more numbers on here. We've got $500 million in water infrastructure improvements. So I'm sorry that they're all getting fixed right now at the same time. Please don't mind the orange barrels. There's a lot of work we've got to do.
I'm sorry.
We continue to invest in affordable housing. MSHDA this year is investing more than $1.4 billion in affordable housing. We've got $50 million ongoing. The treasurer mentioned this. We're taking $50 million in corporate income taxes every year and dedicating it towards housing to help meet our goals and lower costs. This budget also has an additional $100 million one time. That's enough to invest in rehabilitating or building almost 10,000 homes. And then we also have a new housing readiness incentive grant program. Reducing crime is a major priority in this budget. We worked together with the legislature for the first time to dedicate $75 million towards a public safety trust fund. This has been a priority of Mayor Duggan's. We're excited to work with him and the legislature on the policy bills this fall to finalize that, but it's $75 million going directly into communities that are most impacted by violent crime. We also had a huge increase in statutory revenue sharing, another $75 million that we'll be working with the legislature on additional bills to codify a trust fund around that. We've got resources for community violence intervention that's focused on firearm injury and violence prevention. And we're going to hire and train another 120 Michigan State police troopers. Lowering costs has been a major priority for the administration. The treasurer talked about inflation, and while state government can't solve inflation on its own, we've been laser focused on what can we do to bring down costs for small businesses and for families. Between the preschool, free school meals, community colleges, and the Achievement Scholarship, we're saving families almost $50,000 per student. And I think that's really the governor's leadership in showing how we can make a difference in people's lives right now. We're also continuing to implement the Working Families Tax Credit. This is also known as the EITC. We worked together with the legislature last year to quintuple that credit, and it puts more than $600 back in the pockets of working families. We also provided tax relief to seniors to roll back retirement taxes. That saves households an average of $1,000 a year. And then this last one here, I am really excited about. It's another partnership with the treasurer. We're establishing the My Secure Retirement Program, and it's set up to help small businesses provide access to retirement savings for their employees. So my parents are small business owners. They have a heating and cooling company, and it started with just my dad, and his brother joined, and they've grown tremendously. I'm really proud of them. They work their tails off, and no one there has time to research how to set up a 401k program. And so they did it. It took a long time, but we're going to partner with Treasury to set up a program that employers can tap into at no cost to allow their employees to save for their retirement. Just a couple other investments that I'll highlight, and then I know we're looking forward to some Q&A. We're continuing to invest in indigent defense to make sure that everyone has access to representation. During COVID, we set up a racial disparities task force that was very COVID focused, but we've broadened the purview of that group and continue to make investments there. We are doing a huge increase and expansion in certified community behavioral health clinics. This is a huge priority of Senator Stabenow's, and she's been a huge champion for Michigan. There's a tremendous drawdown of federal resources to expand access to behavioral health care and substance abuse disorders throughout Michigan. And then we're also doing grants to eligible nonprofits to address homelessness in the veteran population. That's it.
Those are so many numbers. For a guy who was a political science student and was allergic to math, it kind of makes my head spin a little bit. But I'll start with saying I hope those 120 state troopers that you're hiring are not going to be on I-96 between here and Lansing. I will start with one question, and then I'll open it up to all of you. We all know, we were talking about earlier that come September and October, leading up to the start of the fiscal year, there's likely to be a supplemental budget. There's still, I know, some cash on the balance sheet, but we also need to do a book closing. Are there things left undone in this year's budget that the administration is anticipating trying to make a push for in the next month, 6 weeks, that we should, here in this room should be looking forward to seeing, and we as a chamber might be looking forward to partnering with?
Sure. We left about 320. Now I'm conscious of talking about too many
numbers. No, you
numbers.
can say all the numbers you want. That's fine.
One of my goals
Don't
is
worry
like,
about
how do we make the budget more accessible for real people and talk about how many humans and families it impacts and what does it mean from the micro level. So I'm going to hold myself accountable, but I have to be a nerd for 1 minute and say we have $320 million left on the balance sheet for shared legislative and administrative priorities going into the fall and the end of the year. We'll have some technical close of books to work through, but one of the top priorities for the administration that we would really like to see action on is in the economic development space. So alongside the budget, the governor called for an R&D tax credit. We are very hopeful that we see some movement and traction there. Good Jobs for Michigan 2.0 is what we've been calling, one of those other tools in the toolbox, as well as an extension of SOAR or some sort of another tool in our economic development toolbox. There's a really interesting proposal in the House that would dedicate future corporate income tax dollars towards those incentives, but also invest them in what we would call a more comprehensive economic development strategy. So dedicated revenue to transit, to housing, and community development. So we're excited to continue those conversations into the fall and winter.
And if anyone wants to learn more and maybe contact their legislator, we could talk to probably any of the three of us, probably could give you more information, but that will be eagerly anticipated between now and October 1st. But I'll open it up to anyone here who has questions. Adam has a microphone. Adam will walk around or go, yeah, let's start here.
Hi, good morning, buenos dias. My name is Dana McAllister. I'm Monteros with the W. Buchanan Group. I actually have 2 questions. I'm a small business owner, minority business enterprise certified, and I used to be a school teacher a long time ago. So my concern is that, it's good that you're putting a lot of funding towards the, educational system and a lot of money that continues to grow and go towards the educational system. However, the progress has, based on the charts, it's been decreased, I think, without looking at my sheet. The Detroit Future City created a research document that I believe it was Black students are like 10% reading at the 3rd grade level, English language arts. Hispanics are like 11%. Actually, Hispanics 10%, 11% are the Black students in Detroit, and then the white students are, I think, about 16%. So I'd like to know more about, you're spending all this money. There's a lot of money that's dedicated, but the results are not there. And what the studies show that if a child cannot read at grading level, at the 3rd grade level, it just gets out of hand. And I know from experience being a 4th grade school teacher. So what is the state doing as it relates to the educational system, A? And then my second question is as it relates to health. I saw that the budget, almost 50% of the budget is going towards health and human services. I think that's a large pie, really. I'm not an economist. One of my friends who is said that the health system and the education system are both indicators of how wealthy a society is. I'll close with the fact that I'm Cuban American, and they certainly do not have the same level of money spent for education. However, the kids that do come from Cuba or in Cuba, their educational system is so incredibly amazing, seeing that the money isn't spent, but then the kids can read at grade level and more. So those are my 2 questions.
Those are great questions. There's a lot there, so thank you for those. First, I'll say for our kids, we need to do better. We must do better. The governor shares your concern about educational outcomes, and while we've continued to invest at record levels and will continue that, our schools need a lot more resources, and we also need better outcomes for our kids. And so we're having conversations ongoing with the legislature about what does that look like. Literacy has been a key focus of the governor's, and we stood up. We invested in literacy coaches early on, and we've continued to build on that. And some of that work will take time, but we've got to speed it up, and we must do better. So we share that concern. I am proud that we have continued to invest in a weighted foundation allowance, so making sure that districts who serve kids that need additional support get those dollars, and there's certainly more work to do in that space. In the Department of Health and Human Services, in my nerdy pie chart, a lot of that is federal programs, be it Medicaid, access to Healthy Michigan. That's been a huge focus of the administration, particularly during COVID, making sure that people have access to health care during the pandemic and afterwards, to invest in preventative care. And then we've taken on a huge effort to make sure some of the federal regulations about who can be enrolled fell off, to make sure that we kept Michiganders enrolled and made sure that they had access.
How much of that money in the Health and Human Services section of the pie chart is money that the state has to lay out just to make us Medicaid eligible, right? So we have to pay a certain portion of the Medicaid pie, right? So is it 10% we pay of Medicaid? Is that how it works? So how much of that 22% is just because we have our Medicaid caseload? It's
a great question, and it's changed over time. We have the Medicaid population and then Healthy Michigan, which is our Medicaid expansion. Under the previous administration, Governor Snyder, Michigan went all in on that expansion to take advantage of the additional federal dollars. Over time, the federal support for that has scaled down. So I think to your point, a large part of our general fund is dedicated to making that Medicaid match and Healthy Michigan match, so we can keep Michiganders insured.
Yeah, so to your question, when you see a large number of the Health and Human Services number, a lot of that is just to match the federal Medicaid dollars. We have a question over there, Adam.
Thank you.
Speaking
Adam Carlson.
of Medicaid.
Yeah. Speaking of Medicaid, Adam Carlson, Michigan Health and Hospital Association. Congratulations on the completion of another excellent budget. Makes great investments in Medicaid, behavioral health, maternal health, and growing the talent pipeline. With the recent state Supreme Court decisions on minimum wage and paid sick leave, I know you haven't had a consensus revenue estimating conference yet, but any initial reaction as to what that's going to do on the state budget? I could see it hitting both sides of the equation, both with withholdings going up, but also state costs going up for state employees.
This is an interesting question that, I've seen a lot of economic research, kind of showing both sides of that equation. I think first, stepping back, we have to figure out what are the implications of that ruling. There's an inflation component to try to, figure out what is the, new minimum wage going to look like before we can sort of assess the implications of, how that could change fundamentally our withholdings or our labor force or so on. So I think, I agree with your assessment that it's, a major development in our workforce and labor sector. I just don't think that we're at a point yet where, one, we understand the implications just to, from the outset, and two, kind of haven't worked through, what are those economic impacts going to look like. I anticipate this will be a big conversation heading into the January revenue estimating conference.
From a budgetary standpoint, we're tracking implications to the state as an employer. We anticipate they'll be minimal, but we also are working with the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity on they're the agency that will be tasked with enforcement, but I know the lens is how do we support employers once we understand the implications and what it means. But how do we support employers into coming into compliance and navigating this complex policy, which of course started with ballot language, was interpreted by the courts, and so that will be sort of the administration's take, is how do we support employers through this transition.
All right. Sir?
Good morning. Good morning. My name is, afternoon. My name is George Barnes, and I own Heritage Vision Plan. My question is, I'm in the healthcare, and part of the problem, there are two things going on. There's a bill out called 317, and the bill 317 will allow companies that are not headquartered in Michigan, and if you're headquartered in Michigan, once it gets passed, you have 7 days in which to change your bid. Well, that's one thing we need to work on, to try to get that done. But my real concern is, I'm a veteran, and I hold a license, the only African American in the state of Michigan that holds this license. Medicaid. I'm in Illinois. I have about 800,000 lives that we administer the program. In the state of Michigan, you have about 8 or 9 companies. I have tried for over about 7, 8 years. The governor understands what my plight is. But in these contracts that you have, that you give to these companies, it does not state that they need to look for any companies inside the state of Michigan, even though the governor says in certain areas you should. So for the last 8 years, I've sent letters, I've even had meetings to try to find out if we can administer the vision programs. We've done Ford Motor Company, Stellantis, City, Detroit, Board of Ed, Wayne County. So out of the billions, 15, 18 billion dollars, one company has 12 or 14 billion dollars in the healthcare that they have, they would not allow my company to even bid on it. And I'm headquartered, veteran-owned, in the state of Michigan. So in these contracts that you are giving these 8 or 9 companies, which they've been having them for a long time, some of them are worth, like I said, $20 billion, 18, 10, 12 billion. We need to make sure that inside the contracts that companies like mine are able to bid on the Medicaid contracts. I've been in business going on 50 years next year. When I first started, I won't even say it, but I know people wouldn't even take Medicaid. So my question is, the 317 bill is something that we really need to get behind. It's not a white, black, Hispanic, Asian American. It's a bill that so many billions of dollars leaves the state of Michigan because either you're not allowed to bid on them, or let's say your bid is not the lowest. But if this 317 gets passed, that allows you to go back in and lower your price if you can. Of course, you have to have the capabilities of wherewithal, all of those things being equal. My question is that we're not doing a good job at that. I've talked to the governor, Lieutenant Governor, Tate, I've talked to them all about this whole thing, and especially about these same 7 or 8 or 9 companies that's been holding this Medicaid stuff for the last, I know I've been trying for over 8 years. And I know it's going to, October or January, start all over because it's a 5-year contract, but 3 years optional. So it's still 8 years. So we need to do something about that.
Okay. Any thoughts on procurement? How we can improve procurement?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a conversation offline. I know last year in the budget we proposed and secured some resources in the construction space to help make sure that minority-owned businesses had access to capital to compete for state contracts. And so it's a priority for the administration, investing in Michigan companies, veteran-owned, minority-owned. And so happy to visit to explore if there's other opportunities in the healthcare space as well.
Well, that's good, but we can't let 8 companies continue to have these billions of dollars and not let companies in here. I'm in healthcare, but it's not just healthcare.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Lena Epstein. My company is Vesco Oil Corporation. It was started by my grandfather 3 generations ago, and today we're the 7th largest woman-owned business in Michigan.
Very good.
Thank you. My question has to do with women. We know that this is an extraordinary chamber, a chamber that is focused on equality for all people of all genders. And we know in the state that there is disparity between the earning power of a man and a woman in the state. Vesco Oil, lots of the corporations in this room are working on this issue. Would you speak to this? I'm certain that the governor has a priority on income equality for women and men, but if you would inform us, that would be most appreciative. And thank you again for your time today.
Sure thing. I can start. So I think one of the things that the governor did from the outset was set up the Michigan Women's Commission. And I think it's a commission that's stocked with plenty of incredible women across the state that I personally admire quite a bit, and have provided some guidance at a critical time in evaluating how do things like a pandemic and others impact women as a population. And they've come out with a couple different reports that have illustrated the women's impact on the economy, as well as factors that uniquely impact women, and I think have served as a great foundation for policy recommendations on ways to address. For example, a lot of, in the pandemic, 80-something%, this is one of those statistics from the report, of caretaking responsibilities fell to women. And that was something that persisted, well after kind of the depths of the pandemic, and has been a slow part of the sector, or the workforce sector, to actually return to work. And so I think a lot of the initiatives that Director Flood has outlined are kind of angled in that direction to say, how are we getting, women back in the workforce? And they've been, actually, the return of women to the workforce has been a big reason why our workforce participation rate in Michigan is starting to catch up with the national averages, which it trailed for a long period of time. So I'm grateful for the work that commission has done in highlighting, using data, looking at, in particular, ways that women have been impacted generally and by recent events, and have made recommendations on, where can we start making investments to serve women better in the way that you kind of outlined. And I don't know, Director Flood.
Yeah, maybe just a couple other thoughts. We have made investments in childcare, and I wish we had way more resources to do even more. But increasing access to slots, bringing down costs to help women who are out of the workforce get back in, especially post-COVID, but continuing to build on that. I talked about universal pre-K through an education lens and a saving money for families lens, but it's also one less year of childcare. And so how do we sort of chip away? I don't know that we can flip a switch, but we're looking at how do we increase slots and access for 0 to 3, make pre-K a part of the K-12 system. So every kid starts school at age 4, and we'll continue to fill those gaps. I think one of the things the governor would say, just in terms of leadership, that for me is really exciting, is that when she came in, she removed barriers and made sure that everyone had access to a seat at the table. And when you look at her senior leadership team and our cabinet, it's pretty incredible. Before I started this job, I was in one of my last meetings with the governor and lieutenant governor and the legislative leaders, the Democratic leaders, and I was looking around the table, and you have a female governor, female Senate Majority Leader, African American Lieutenant Governor, and the first Black Speaker of the House, and then staff that equally reflected the diversity of the principals. And it was one of those moments to me that I know for certain that room has never looked the way that it did. And I think when you have representation at the table and those different perspectives that are coming forward on how do we make policy considerations, how do we invest the dollars that are available to us, we're moving in the right direction. And I also think there's a tremendous opportunity to partner with the private sector, where people are leading and doing really innovative work. So we have more to do and look forward to partnering on it.
I'm glad you brought up that last point, Jen, because as an observer and someone who's close to both of you and the governor, I've noticed that too, that I think especially when it comes to women, the number of women who are in senior roles in the administration. You two, Joanne Hall's the chief of staff, throughout the executive office, I think that has made a noticeable difference. I mean, when you brought up the daycare example today, the fact that you have mothers, I mean, it's not fair that mothers bear the disproportionate weight of child rearing, but the fact is that they do. I think that has made a difference in the policies that you've made. So I think that is a very, very important point. The people who are in the room have made a noticeable difference in the policies that have come out. We've got time for one more question, I think, but I hope that our guests will stick around to chat for a little bit, or have time to chat for a little bit when we're done. Yes.
Hi, thank you. Stephanie Blatt with Consumers Energy. I have a question. We saw a large influx of cash from the federal government during COVID times, and it really helped individuals and families kind of rectify their financial situation. A lot of them went from red to black, which was great. You could argue that could have taken us into where we are today with inflation, what have you. Inflation is now affecting everyone. We could all say that. And then we see, I can't remember which publication it was, one of the W's, I'm sure, the Journal or the Post or something like that, that said they are seeing families and individuals going into debt in much larger amounts. It continues to rise, different factors, whatever it is. The influx of cash is kind of dried up, inflation, you say it. And it really, you kind of look at that, you see companies rectifying their headcount situations, not just here in Michigan, but throughout the United States. How is Michigan, specifically our bank account, how are we preparing for possible, not going to say it, slow down? As you see individuals, when you start to see them going to the red, they spend less, they start to worry. How is our savings count? How are you looking into this, into future budgets and spending and everything like that? And because we went through one of the worst downturns, and so Michigan got right, but who knows what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, and I think that exact point is why we have a much more conservative forecast. If you'll recall, those on the sales tax forecast, we had kind of a big experience of those purple bars increasing very quickly. The teal bars being the forecast was basically flat for that period of time, sort of recognizing a lot of the headwinds that you described. The question that you're asking, I think, is the question as a revenue forecaster that we've been trying to identify for the last several years, which is, at what point will we see that stimulus, start to dry up? If people saved money because they just couldn't spend it, they weren't going out, they weren't, spending it in the ways that they normally would, they saved it. At some point, that's going to prop up spending for some period of time. But then, what happens when that dries up? Are they going to, stop spending? Are they going to take on deficit spending? And so we're watching that really closely. And as we have each of these revenue conferences, it gives us an opportunity to, reassess of, do we still have it right that we're looking at kind of a flat sales tax performance? What we can see in some of the data, and shout out to JP Morgan. JP Morgan Institute has provided some great data from their economists showing, all of the various types of income coming in, including pandemic unemployment assistance and other types. Don't worry if you have a JP Morgan account, this is macro data. Eubanks is not seeing what you're spending money on. But the point here is like we can see it. We can see what's generally happening. It gives us a little bit of an indicator of what's happening. But we're absolutely watching it really, really closely. I would just say, hopefully to provide a little bit of comfort, about a year ago in our forecast, we did think that there was going to be a recession of some duration in this year, whether it was a quarter or 2 quarters. And that's actually something that when we came back in May, we took that out of the forecast. We're not anticipating that we will see a downturn or slowdown. That doesn't mean that we won't see slower growth, just not negative growth. But I think a lot of the fears we had about recessions have sort of gone away. Certainly the stock market concerns earlier last week, is a lot to pay attention to. But I think there were some unique circumstances there. And if I could just close on one point as economists, which is the stock market does not equal the economy. What people do does not necessarily directly correlate to what happening on any major index. So, but thank you for tuning into that, because I think that's exactly the point.
I'm happy to touch on the spending side, some of the steps we've taken to sort of hedge against that risk. with some of the federal packages during COVID, the state had a huge influx of federal dollars, more than $6 billion. And we knew from the start that those were going to be one-time resources. And so we were meticulous about investing those only in one-time investments and projects. And so from our standard operating baseline budget, none of that was ever factored in. As well as one-time revenues that we see from consumers spending more. Our budgets are built on fiscal sustainability. And so all of our budgeting we've done the past few years is based on the revenues that we anticipate will be ongoing. And then at the same time, we built up our rainy day fund over $2.2 billion. So at some point, there will be a recession.
A rainy day.
That's why it's one day there will be a rainy day.
Only in Ohio.
Yes. And we think we'll be well positioned to weather that.
Good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you. This has been incredibly informative, and I'm sorry I gave you a hard time about the numbers. I actually like the numbers. I just don't always understand them. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Jen and Rachel, for being our special guests. Look forward to doing this again sometime soon, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat for a little bit afterwards. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.